evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 109 of the Retrospectives podcast, Advance Wars. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, James Turlings. James, we return to the tactical genre with a bang. We've done a couple of games like this. We've done Panzer General. Fire Emblem is pretty closely related to this, and of course, we've done Gorky 17. So we're not newcomers to this tactical genre. Had you played Advance Wars before? Have you dabbled in these games? I'm guessing you have, given that you loved your handheld consoles in the past.
Yeah, I played 1 and 2 and the DS version of the game quite a bit growing up, so I've beaten 1 multiple times and 2 multiple times. So this series is nothing new to me, and I'm glad we get to revisit it. Like, I haven't played it since, over 10 years ago, so I thought, I basically am going to have a different perspective going in for this episode, which is always really fun.
Yeah, I've played these games a little bit. As I've mentioned on the show before, I did do a bit of emulation when I was growing up on my PC with some of these Game Boy games, and Advance Wars was one of them. But it wasn't one that I really stuck with too long. Like, I played it for an hour or two, got the basics of it, and then moved on. But it's one I've always been intrigued in. I know that people love these games to death. And there was always something about the elegance of the design that really appealed to me. It's got a lot less going on than something like Fire Emblem in terms of story and characters and abilities and stats. But that may be to its strength more than its detriment.
Yeah, it ends up playing more like military chess than, Fire Emblem or something else where you have a lot of characters and abilities. And the simplicity, like low number values, lack of RPG progression kind of thing, does lend it this very pick up and play approach that worked very well on handheld. There was a remaster that came out recently, which gave us a lot of suggestions to play this one. So I'm glad we got all those, and looking forward to reviewing it.
Yeah. Now, you and I didn't play the new one, did we, James? I was considering buying the new one so that we'd have the contrast between the old and new. However, the game costs $90, and I wasn't quite ready to shell out $90 on a game that would probably take about
Australia tax.
5 to 6 hours.
It costs more money to ship those digital editions, through the underground cables or the satellite, whatever they're doing these days. Just too expensive. The logistics just insane.
Yeah, so the price of free was too good to pass up. It's kind of frustrating because I'm pretty sure I would have shelled out $50 on this game, even if I'd only played Advance Wars 1, but it was just a bit too
90
steep.
is a bit crazy, yeah.
So we'll be getting into our gameplay and story discussion of Advance Wars in just a moment, but for those who have never listened to us before, James and I make up the Retrospectives podcast. What we do each and every 3 weeks is we play through a retro classic or cult game of the past with the intention of reviewing it from a modern perspective. We're not here to evaluate and understand these games in the context in which they are produced. We simply want to know how good it is today when compared side by side with many of the indie and not so indie titles that get released every single day. Now, this may seem like an unfair standard of criticism at first, and to some degree it is, but what we've discovered over the past 4 or 5 years of doing this show is that a lot of the time, the way games were designed in the past, which many would or some would consider is a more old-fashioned way of designing games, is actually not old-fashioned at all. In fact, in some ways and in some cases, you have games that are considerably better than their modern counterparts entirely because of those supposedly outdated design principles. And I think this is fascinating. Now, some of the games we've played have been outright stinkers as well, but in just as many cases, we've discovered that these games can produce a unique and interesting experience that is otherwise very hard to get with modern game design, with the indie scene aside, of course, because the indie scene is one of the best scenes to revive and rediscover what it was about these old games that was so special. So we come in from that perspective, and we find that it's a harsh standard of criticism, but one that is able to uncover gems far better than a more nostalgic driven discussion. So if you like the sound of what we're doing, or you want to listen to our other episodes, you can find all of our content on our website, which is rspodcast.net. And we've also got a Buy Me a Coffee page if you'd like to support the show monetarily. So let's talk Advance Wars. So Advance Wars is a turn-based tactics slash strategy video game developed by Intelligent Systems, and it was first released in 2001 for the surprisingly the Game Boy Advance. It came out in the following years in Australia and the EU, and it came out in Japan actually like 3 years later, which is very unusual for a Game Boy game. Usually, it tends to be the other way around. So in this game, you play as an advisor to the commanders of the Orange Star Army. You're basically leading the battles, but there are other characters who are the actual generals who are in charge. You're the advisor, so you're doing everything, but the game uses this role of you being the advisor to these characters so that you can play as the different COs who are unexpectedly attacked, who have to fight back to claim that territory and maybe discover the cause of the war along the way. Uh, that's really all I'm going to say for the story because we're getting into in just a moment. But that's the basic setup. You're kind of fighting a defensive operation to begin with, and then you're more invading other territories to get to the bottom of what's going on. So to give you guys we probably will start with story discussion, but I think it's a good idea to paint a picture of what the very basic setup of this game is like. So it's a 2D overview, so you can see a map. Most of the time, this map screen is fairly small, so it will be a bit bigger than what you can see on one screen, so you can scroll left or right to see more of the battlefield, but it's a relatively small screen, unlike something like Panzer General, where the maps are massive. It's more akin to Fire Emblem in that way, and that the map is pretty easy to grok in your head with a couple of short scrolls around the screen. So it's top-down perspective, and both players have army units. So they've got tanks and infantry. They've got flying units like copters and bombers, and they have naval units like submarines and battleships. Each turn, you can move these units around the map to either engage with enemies or, if in the case of infantry, capture buildings and bases to advance your economy or production. The objective of each mission is usually to destroy all enemy units or capture your enemy's headquarters, which can once again only be done with infantry. But throughout the campaign, you'll have special objectives as well, like rescuing a unit, i.e., protecting it for a certain number of turns, or it could just be holding out and surviving for a certain number of turns before you can inevitably turn the tide and finish the mission. These missions tend to be pretty short. You can normally knock them over in 15 to 20 minutes. They're usually only 5 to 10 turns, depending on how quickly you can run them over. So it's a very tight, short, fast dose of tactical action.
Yeah. It's not like super complex. All of the units have very simple rules. They don't have special abilities. It's more of a matter of playing the tight and meaningful terrain features, capturing to boost your economy, and building the right units to counter the units your opponent has. Or if there are no buildings, if there are no unit producing buildings, which is the case for a lot of the missions, just figuring out how to maximize what you do have, because there is no, in a lot of strategy games, there'd be like building, like you can make new buildings on the map. That's not the case here. Each of the map has buildings in pre-existing locations, and that's it.
Yeah, and notably, as James said, there's no progression here. There's no unit veterancy, units that carry over from map to map. There's no units leveling up and gaining abilities like Fire Emblem. There's no unit levels. It's not like your units are getting stronger. A tank is always a tank is always a tank. There is some variability to the unit's relative power depending on which CO you choose and who the enemy CO is. But if you're playing a map, your tanks will always be tanks of exactly the same strength level, and the same is true of the enemy commanders. So there's a consistency here that doesn't require advanced mathematics to understand relative unit strength or values. It's kind of very set in stone, and it's a known information game. I think James mentioning, that this is, battle chess is pretty accurate. There is a little bit more going on under the hood, but for the most part, it's a known information game.
So let's move on to the basic story and the premise and that kind of thing. And I think the thing that stands out is probably the tone and the presentation of the game. Advance Wars is a fairly like bright and cheerful game with peppy characters and an energetic soundtrack. And there's really, for a game about war between like four countries, there is like zero mention of any of this basically, and it's all presented as a big game of chess between friends basically, despite them actually being at war. Which, as a child, I never really noticed this distinction, but playing it as an adult, this stuck out to me very early on, and I promptly got over it. But it was a bit odd to begin with.
It is funny, isn't it? Because it plays out more like a board game between friends, as you said. And I mean, the content of this game is people dying, and you see the units get shot to pieces. But this game is rated E for everyone, so they've clearly gone a long way to divorce war from its horrific reality as much as possible. For the most part, I think it works. Like you kind of
Yeah.
you kind of forget the actual real life context of this game and can just ignore it entirely as a gameplay board game essentially. But it is funny to think about, isn't it? Like we've played games that are like this. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is the obvious one, where they do take serious effort to explore some of the realities of war, not in an R-rated way, but there is some confrontation of the circumstances of it and reinforced through gameplay with character death. Here, there's actually nothing. Like even the enemies that are invading you, it's kind of like G-rated cartoon interactions, and in the end, they end up all friends together anyway. It's all some big misunderstanding that they've had
Yeah.
all of these people die over. So I actually don't think this is a bad thing because they do.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
got to say while playing through it, it's able to sell it to the point where you forget about the reality of what you're doing. And if the game is that successful at doing it, it's hard to be too mad about it.
Yeah, and they really commit to their presentation, I think. This game, and we're, touching on aesthetics here, actually, I think it still looks really good. Lots of the character models, it's all 2D sprites. They bounce around when in their idle positions, and their battle animations are really like fairly detailed and do a really good job of like capturing, the type of unit you're using and their strengths and weaknesses. The character sprites are all fun and enjoyable. The lines, not a lot of them make me laugh out loud, but they have this like pleasant tone that's kind of hard to, not be charmed by. I think they did a really good job, and it all really works well. And I think it works especially well with the really small kind of cartoony map that has, very meaningful terrain features on it, but at the end of the day is kind of tiny.
Yeah, I'm less high on the actual interactions between characters. It's just too shallow to really have me
Yeah.
engaged with at any level whatsoever. And the story kind of wraps up unconvincingly very quickly. So while I agree that the aesthetic here is incredible, I think that little thing, like it's a tiny little thing, but the units bobbing up and down on the map, I know it sounds insane, but if the game did not have that, the game would look way worse. That tiny little bobbing up and down animation adds so much personality to these characters with how they're presented. It's nuts. And I think that when the units get into a battle, so you have like your recon units firing at infantry, it just looks fantastic. Like it looks really, really good. Definitely better than Panzer General. And I far
Yeah.
prefer the simpler animations to what they were doing with the 3D models in Fire Emblem, which are just like,
It doesn't look very good,
no,
no.
the 3D models have not aged well for their combat, but the 2D sprites, they've aged fantastically. And yeah, I love the look of this game.
I I especially like how lots of the units like have different combat animations based on their terrain. Like you
Mm,
will just see your units firing out of a forest. And this kind of idea they have where they split the screen in two and kind of show like a zoomed in perspective of each unit, like without the space in between. I think it actually works really well for conveying the location and the terrain bonuses to the player,
mm.
because you can have like a unit in a forest, and on the left of the screen they'll be standing just in a forest, shooting at some characters just on a mountain. There's no explanation of what's in between, like where the mountain connects to the forest, but you don't need that. You just need to know like what defensive bonus they're getting basically.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, and I think you're right that the map does a great job of conveying the information to the player. There's never any ambiguity about where
yeah,
you are, what you're standing in, what the relative bonuses will be. There's a great effort to communicate all of that to the player as cleanly as possible. So not only are the aesthetics, not only does this game look really good, it's it's a kind of good that doesn't get in the way of the gameplay at all, and in many ways enhances it. So
yeah,
I really have nothing bad to say about the general presentation of this game. The story is definitely undercooked,
yes, it is undercooked.
but at the
I agree
same
with that.
time, I mean, would I have enjoyed a deeper story with these kinds of characters and this kind of presentation? I don't think so. Like, to be completely
No,
honest, this isn't my kind of story at all. It's a game that's rated E for everyone. They were never going to have any proper deep exploration of any of these themes, as far as I can tell. Maybe they've got better campaign stories in the later games, but my feeling is that the very minimalist approach worked in its favor because you can focus on the general presentation as opposed to getting stuck in the weeds with a shitty story.
yeah, I agree with that. I think you could have made the dialogue, had it be a bit funnier had it be a bit funnier in certain spots. Like I think the snappiness and the small amount of it is really good. I think you can probably squeeze a bit more enjoyment out of that small amount of dialogue they do have, though. I think it can feel a bit flat at
The
times, but
Japanese general is good. I like him. How he's an idiot.
yeah,
It's quite
he's just a
funny,
complete
and
idiot.
his daughter
Yeah.
actually knows much better than him what to do. But each of the missions that he's in, it's quite good because you have story and gameplay flow. Like he'll say something, completely misunderstand the strategic impact, and then you go into a mission where you actually get to see that in reality. Definitely the
Yes.
best instance of that is where his daughter's like, you need to capture more bases. He's like, I will capture the base closest to the enemy. And then he has a land base on an island that's just
Yes.
completely irrelevant. He just builds a bunch of units from it. So this small island is filled with ground units that just stand there doing
Just
nothing.
can't do
Yeah.
anything. Yeah,
And
that was
and that
great.
was really good because you kind of got the story and the
Like,
gameplay meshing together in a very funny way.
yeah, in a way that a lot of the others don't, I think. So, good job there. If we saw more stuff like that, then I think it would be, a very easy pass for the story. But even without that, I think the presentation's great and I love it to bits.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason we see less of that is how the story is always at the tail end and beginning of missions. You get no story mid mission, and you get no real, I guess, gameplay developments mid mission. Like one of the things that Fire Emblem does a lot is it'll do ambushes or reinforcements arriving, and they're basically moments to communicate story mid mission. Advance Wars has none of that. What you see at the start of the mission is always what you get, which isn't a bad thing from a gameplay perspective, but it does restrict its ability to.
Actually, I disagree, sort of. I think the first time you encounter a new commanding officer, they often do this thing where you don't know what their power is yet, and it takes you by surprise halfway through the
That
mission.
is
Like,
true. Yeah. Okay.
what's his name? The guy, is it who can fly? Eagle?
Eagle. Yeah.
Has his power is he takes 2 turns in a row. That caught me completely off guard. Spoilers, the final boss's mission is he summons a meteor that crushes a 9x9, a 3x3 square. That was fun to discover. Like the tsunami or the blizzard, those kinds of things I think do work in that respect.
Yeah, on you make a great point, James. When the enemy commanders do first use their CO power, that is a story moment for sure. But yeah, in general, you don't have that mid mission thing. Like when we did Panzer General, one of the things I mentioned about the story was that the story value of that game is very rooted in history. So if you're history buff, you can appreciate it. With Fire Emblem, not only do you get reinforcements and ambushes and things, you also just get mid battle character interactions, whether you're rescuing
Yeah,
someone from a house or you're fulfilling the mini objectives of recruiting NPCs or whatever. So the story is very laced throughout the gameplay. Here, it's just the light touch. The focus is very much on the gameplay, but I don't want to undersell how much the presentation here kind of gives the game a flavor that you can kind of sink your teeth into, even if this like the main plot is very light.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that I think some people are going to like that there's not much interruption during the battles. Like, it just lets you get on with it and play the game for much of it. So, mileage is going to vary there depending on how much you care about that kind of thing in your strategy games.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. This isn't. I'm not framing these things as bad things. I think that for people who want a more gameplay focused experience, Advance Wars is absolutely going to deliver without a bunch of complications. But it is worth noting that this is like the story here is a very light touch. So if you're the kind of person who gets a lot more invested in characters as part of your tactical gameplay experience, a la Fire Emblem, then this is a very different kind of experience. I think it's important to differentiate them.
Yeah, I agree with that. So on the whole, pretty positive with, some, debatable things here and there depending on your preferences. Let's move on to a quick music break. I thought that it was funny. I think that it's really cool that every single commanding officer has a unique battle theme, and during a mission, whenever the turns switch, it switches music for the active turn player's current commander's theme. So you end up getting a lot of variety throughout the campaign generally. Normally throughout the campaign, you've got a selection between 3 characters to pick from, so you end up hearing their themes a lot. It was a bit actually annoying at the start. If you do the tutorial, you have the same character 10 turn, like the same 2 characters for 10 missions in a row, so it does start to get a bit repetitive. And because you switch turns so much, you end up hearing the start of every character's themes way more than the mid and the late sections, which kind of, adds to that feeling of repetition. That aside, though, I really like the music in this game. I think it's all very expressive, and really gets across the qualities of the character. I particularly like Sammy and Olaf's theme, and I think most of the music in this game is good. And there's a couple of tracks that are quite good.
So I have to admit to not actually listening to very much music while I was playing. I did the thing I did with Fire Emblem where I was playing with the game sped up to 400% or so. So to make the animations faster. So I'm one of those guilty people who didn't listen to it much. I will say off the bat, I don't think this is a game which requires that kind of speed up compared to Fire Emblem, because the animations are a lot snappier and things just move faster in general. But it's still a nice quality of life thing if you really want to zip through everything. But I did go back and listen to the soundtrack, and I do think that it is a good soundtrack. It's very drum heavy, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of these are military themes with one or two exceptions. So they're kind of like, I guess the closest thing to it would be something like Red Alert 2's OST, and I think that Sturm's theme is actually something that
really
could
great.
pretty closely fit onto the Red Alert 2 soundtrack. I think the music here is good. I like it, but I also think this is a game where you probably don't need to be listening to the music because the story is so stripped out of the gameplay. There's not as much emotional investment in in the gameplay experience.
Yeah, the music isn't driving home anything other than high tempo energeticness. Like you could swap it out for anything on that theme and still,
You could listen to a podcast. I think while playing this game, you're very focused on the gameplay. The music is not out of place here. The music is not bad. You could listen to the music and have a fine time. But I also don't. Of all the games we've played, this is one of those games where I don't believe the music is an essential part of the experience.
Yeah, even when we did like Fire Emblem, I think that narratively, like it can shift the tone quite a bit, like
yes,
from mission to mission, and so the music there really does help to elevate that.
Mhm.
Here, the tone is always peppy and energetic, and it never changes basically for the whole game.
Except for
So
maybe Sturm's theme. That definitely
yeah,
has, and in general, the last couple of missions you play against him, there's something more discordant about those final battles. Yeah.
So I agree with that, and I still listen to the music the whole way through because I liked it. But I can get behind that as well.
Yeah. All right, James, what song are we doing?
So I would have picked probably Andy's theme because it's probably the most iconic. If I hadn't been like if that hadn't been drilled into my ear during the
Hmm.
tutorial, and I came to hate it a little bit for a while there. So I'm gonna go with Sammy's theme. It's kind of also on that spectrum of being really energetic. And I ended up playing that character quite a lot in the war room missions, just because I think infantry are probably the best units in the game,
Hmm.
and having better infantry is awesome. So this is Sammy's theme. Righty, that was Sammy's theme, and we are going to start talking about the gameplay now. I think for me, probably the most obvious place to start is to start talking about the web of units, because I think in a tactics game, especially one that's kind of maybe reminiscent of chess with a bit more rock, paper, scissors, this is probably like the key part that makes the game fun or not. If you get this wrong, the game kind of isn't enjoyable to play. And I think they did quite a good job. There's a lot of unit types, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses, from your artillery to your infantry, your air units and your naval units. And I kind of enjoyed figuring out how best to make use of them. And that kind of changes based on your commanding officer too.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about that basic rock paper scissors. So the idea is that you've got, for example, let's start with something like a tank, just your normal regular tank. So tanks have good movement along roads and open terrain. They can't go over mountains, but they can go through forests, albeit far far slower than your infantry. They are effective in combat against infantry units and lighter vehicles, so the recons and the APCs. But they are weak to heavier units, the heavy tanks, as well as the artillery and rockets. And they get absolutely murdered by the aircraft units, uh, so your battle copters and your bombers. So we have with the medium tank a basic outline of what this unit's strengths and weaknesses are. And the final, I guess, lever by which they balance these units' strengths and weaknesses is their economic cost. And even though economic cost isn't always relevant in these missions, where some of them they just provide you with units, you also have to do a calculation on the tank's cost, which is 7k, versus your medium tank's cost, which is 16k. And I would say pretty much every unit in the game, you can give a list of these kinds of strengths and weaknesses, which balances them against the other units in the game.
I think that it's kind of relevant in this discussion to mention that if you own a city, you'll get 1,000 gold per turn, and you'll normally start with like 4 or 5, and then get up to maybe like 6 or 8 near the end of a mission. So, a 16,000 gold medium tank is quite an investment. So there is a lot of opportunity cost decision making when it comes to building the units. And then their speed, the kind of map you're on, how much like cover terrain there is, how difficult the terrain is to navigate, kinds of plays, quite a big factor. Even stuff like the distance between your base and the next closest unoccupied cities is really important to consider, because you can only capture cities with infantry units, and infantry are the cheapest and weakest units in the game. And there's a stronger infantry unit, the mech, that has like a rocket launcher, but has much reduced movement. They're very slow. So, um, like early on, you kind of try to buy a lot of light units, and you can maybe spend some money on like an APC to ferry units back and forth, because they can pick up infantry and drop them down with greater movement. or you can buy stuff like recon units to get in early and start harassing units to stop them capturing bases, that kind of thing. I found that generally, um, in the campaign, they did a good job of having missions that incentivized all the unit types. And then when I went back and started playing the individual versus maps, you really got a sense for managing the economy a bit more than you did in the campaign.
I think that the balance in this game is actually
Yeah,
fantastic. Now, it's never going to be perfect, right? Like you never ever for a game without online updates, you're just not going to reach a level of balance perfection in version 1.0 for a video game of this era. But realistically, they did a
yes.
really good job. You can justifiably purchase every unit in this game and not be too unhappy with it because every single unit does something relevant for the cost of it being produced. Even something like the recon unit, which is like fairly dinky, that gets murdered by pretty much everything except your vanilla infantry, has the effect of revealing units in Fog of War with a massive radius, which is incredible. Even your shitty infantry, which are killed by everything, well, they capture buildings, so you can't hate them. Even the crazy expensive units, so the battleships and the
The bombers are
bombers,
like
are
insane if you actually
still
get them out.
it's
Yeah.
still really good. Yeah, like it's still you still don't feel bad about producing any of these units because they all do something amazing. I would say the unit I used probably the least was the artillery, the basic artillery,
Really?
just generally
Okay.
because well, I used
Yeah.
rockets a lot, but artillery were usually my stopgap. Like I'd build one or two of them to help me transition to the late game. But even then, they're still doing something very
Yes.
valuable to get me to the late game. So, man, I think the balance here is really good, and it's more complicated than rock paper scissors because of the relevant movement of the different units. The fact that aerial units obviously have unprecedented movement with no terrain restrictions, but they tend to be more vulnerable. I mean, the naval units are generally
Probably the
kind of
worst. I'd say the
worse
worst unit is the anti-air missile. It's just extremely expensive. Yeah,
and narrow.
where because like the normal anti-air tank is very cheap. Like it costs 1,000 more than a regular tank at 8,000, and it always one-shots
Mm.
like basically any aerial unit and has quite large movement range.
And Rex
Yeah,
infantry,
so I
which is
found
funny.
the more expensive missiles to be like a waste of investment compared to the
That's true. I didn't buy them. The other problem is they still get destroyed by bombers because the bombers'
is
movement
quite
range
large.
is such that they can sweep
Yeah.
in on them before they get an attack off. Whereas the rockets, you will almost always get at least one attack off on the unit that's coming to get you. So yeah, the missiles are quite bad. I don't know if they have applications in the larger the larger multiplayer maps because the
Yep.
maps are bigger. But you're right. The anti aircraft guns are goated, so you
Those
just
guns
end
are
up using
amazing, and I
those
think
more than
their
anything.
existence kind of makes like bombers are really expensive and extremely powerful. Like they will just wreck tanks, but they will also just die in one attack from an anti-air tank, which is super cheap. So normally when I found in the maps where you could have aerial units, you really wanted to like get into a position where you could suppress the enemy's anti-air tanks first before sending them in, which kind of like led
Mm.
to this like slow deliberate advance to a base before, you know, taking out the key. You want to take out the rocks before you build scissors in this game a lot of the time, and I thought that was really well done.
The battle choppers are really strong for that
Yeah,
cost as well. I can't
they're
believe how
like
cheap they are.
9,000. Yeah.
I was 8,000 or
Yeah, and
9,000. They were
transport
very
copters are
affordable.
definitely they're the best infantry carriers because they move over terrain quite quickly, and over mountains, which is really important. I thought that the way they did terrain in this game was quite good. I really like how pronounced the terrain bonuses are. Like, a rocket launcher infantry on a mountain will just beat a tank because the mountain provides so much cover. Same with woods provide a lot. So you end up like really like taking care of positioning and the way the maps are designed really impact your strategy a lot. I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I feel like maybe I've misunderstood this game, or you understood it better than me, James, because I found that the terrain, while it mattered, wasn't as deep as you're suggesting. I found that in general, my positioning was far more related to where the enemy happened to be positioning, as opposed to maximizing my terrain bonuses. Uh, to take a step back, the broad strategy that I would say I would use was that of counter-attacking. To start with, I was playing very aggressively. I was basically bum rushing the enemy, but that stopped working even as soon as mission, I don't know, about
Yeah,
halfway through the campaign. And my broad strategy tended to coalesce around, I guess, the shitty AI. So in most of these missions, you start out outnumbered by the enemy. The enemy has a superior force to you. And in broad strokes, getting your initial attack off is much stronger than defending. So attack when you attack, you shoot first, then the enemy will counterattack if they're able to, like if it's a tank versus a tank. And they'll be attacking you. They won't really do that much damage back usually. So what I would do is I would position my units in a way so that when the enemy advanced forwards, I would be able to use my units to launch a large counterattack all at the same time on those enemy units, massively reduce their forces, and therefore reduce the potential damage they can inflict back on me when it's their turn. And I would say that I tended to pay a lot more attention to the potential movement ranges of the enemy and the potential actions that they could take against me versus positioning myself in the terrain perfectly, because a lot of the time I was just trying to finish these missions as quickly
yeah.
as possible.
It's interesting. I find there's a big distinction between the maps where you can build units and the ones where you can't. I think that
Mm-hmm.
strategy games like this, and this was very pronounced when we did Fire Emblem, tend to have this thing where early turn turtling is super encouraged. Like you just wait for them to come to you because they spread out. They
Mm-hmm.
don't hold like clever formations. They don't send their tankiest units in first. They just send a few units in to die one by one. Like you just have a mech unit sitting in a city, and the tank will rock up, shoot it. They'll actually get to like the same health because of the terrain bonus, and then you can counterattack to kill, heal up, and then once you've thinned out the forces, then you can start your advance. Whereas, yeah, and this was more pronounced when you couldn't build units yourself, I think, just because you
Mm-hmm.
really, really had to protect and heal your units up, or you could just lose the mission. Whereas I think when you can build units, it starts becoming more about like controlling areas of the map and trying to like if you're not going for a rush strategy, like you kind of just want to control as many cities as possible for like a large number of turns to accumulate a big economic advantage and then crush them in the later turns with, you know, heaps of bombers and that kind of thing. And I think getting to that point, you know, isn't always as simple as just waiting for them to come to you.
Yeah, it's funny because I enjoyed the missions where, because there's broadly two kinds of missions and there are some special ones, but it's the ones where you can build
Yeah.
and the ones where you can't. The ones where you can't, you have limited forces. So if you have a bad turn, and James, I failed
Yeah,
missions.
me
Like
too.
definitely I failed missions. Particularly often the first time I'd try it, I would overextend. They'd wipe out a few of my units and I'd be like, shit, that was my only medium tank. I don't know how I'm meant to
Yeah.
take out their medium tank now that they've got a full health unit. So you make mistakes and you get punished very harshly for them. I generally enjoyed those more, even though I was using the same broad strategy of counterattacking, because there was a bit of nuance to that. You can't just move your units randomly and hope things work out. You still need to seize opportunities to like take out those enemy rockets if they're in range, because they're going to
I
do a lot of
found
damage to if you let them live, for example.
Yeah, I found those missions to be better when there was fog of war. And like
Mm,
if there was flying units and artillery and rockets, because if you hide a rocket in a forest, you have to be right next to the forest to see the unit, and they can attack you while invisible, basically. So If
And they have absurd range. Like they have a range probably 1 unit greater than I would typically expect
yeah,
from a game like this. I don't think they've got an unfair range or anything. It's just that they've got an actual balanced power curve for a long range sniping unit. Whereas I think that like in Fire Emblem, um,
archers are kind of bad.
yeah, they're kind of bad. Whereas in this game, your archer units, the artillery, they feel like
But
the appropriate power level. They're super vulnerable and they die easily, but they dish out serious damage at a serious range if you leave them
yeah,
unmolested.
and one of the commanding officers has an extra range as his passive, which makes it even trickier
Yeah.
sometimes. Yeah, I thought that's good. I like missions like that. Because with the fog of war, like at some point you have to push forward, like into unknown territory, be that with your recon unit, or if one's died, like maybe an infantry. But like you can't expose your infantry because if you run out of infantry, you can't capture anymore, and you kind of just lose. So you kind of have to risk putting a tankier unit out there, and there might just be two artillery hiding there, and you just lose it. So, there was a bit of, give and take with that, which I thought made the fog of war missions more enjoyable than, when you can see the whole map and you only have a few units.
I do think you raise an interesting point though, James, about the incentives in these build missions potentially being more interesting because if you're in a build mission and you need to seize territory to get your economy rolling, in theory that does provide, a lot more grounds for tactical decision making,
Yeah,
right? Than these missions where you can kind of turtle up a bit and take your time. I think that here the map is like the game is kind of hurt by its decision to have far more smaller and simpler battle maps because the vast majority of the time there's only a single front of battle really. Like there might be one or two units defending an area where you want to seize units, but it doesn't really open up a whole new front of battle where you're having to fight on 2 to 3 fronts at once. It's usually just you have the one main area where conflict is occurring, usually around some choke point or central part of the map. And you can pretty safely
yeah.
take the others, divert what you think is slightly more resources than what they have to that area of the map you seize it. And then it ultimately all comes down to the same kind of broad death ball strategy.
Yeah, the maps
This
where it
is
was like an S and you kind of just linear progress down a road until the end were probably my least favorite just because of that.
hmm,
Whereas I found outside of the campaign, the War Room maps generally had these more like you could approach the enemy base from three different angles and you kind of wanted
hmm.
to because there was like buildings that you wanted to capture on different sides of the map. Rush strategies aside, which I think are quite powerful in this game. So there is a bit more nuance in those maps. I actually found that playing the non-campaign maps, it felt more like playing quote unquote the real game,
Hmm.
where you had access to every unit type, most types of bases, generally every type of terrain, and it was just like pure strategy.
It's funny. I think one of the differences between this and a traditional RTS, we haven't done StarCraft one for the show, but I did it over with the Nostalgia Goggles podcast. Is that by the end of those StarCraft one campaigns with each races, you got access to everything, and you kind of saw the economic end game of what those games were promising, where you could set up 2, 3, 4 bases and have your economy in full swing, and have 6 or 7 unit producing buildings and kind of go ham. The game never really reaches that point in the campaign.
Yeah,
You just don't get that full strategic outlook, and the game never demands that you kind of fully come to grips with having a bunch of production buildings and a bunch of economy, and you're having to make serious decisions about which units to buy and kind of what your strategic direction should be. This is very much a tactics game in my mind, at least in the first campaign, because the scope of the confrontations remain small enough. Uh, Even though I think all the building blocks are here for a full blown strategy game.
yeah. On so I wanted to also talk about commanding officers and their balance in this game.
Of
So, yeah,
course.
so generally the commanding officer you pick comes with a positive bonus. So if we take Max for example, his positive bonus is he does 50% more damage with direct units. like
Very
tanks, very
balanced, of
balanced,
course.
totally balanced. His downside is all his ranged units, like his artillery, have one less range, which is actually like quite.
It sounds
It's
significant,
so
and it
it's very
is.
significant, yes. And his superpower, and everyone gets like a power that builds up every turn that they can use, once every like 5 turns or something. Is just like even more damage. Basically, like his tanks will just one hit other tanks quite comfortably during that turn. There's a commanding officer like Olaf who makes it snow for 2 turns, or his turn and your turn, that drastically slows down enemy movement and powers up his units. There's Sammy, whose thing is all her infantry gets double movement for the turn and captures better. There's a lot of variety in the commanding officers. I think that makes you. There's one character whose thing is units cost more but do a bit more damage, so they have just slightly tankier units. There's quite a bit of variety here. I think that the balance is correct on the most part for the game. If you are trying to evaluate the balance in terms of like a competitive multiplayer setting, I would say it's not very good. But for a mostly, and I would mostly consider this game single player, I think they did a good job because basically you command the Orange Star commanders, and there's 3 of them. There's Andy, Max, and Sammy. Max is ridiculously overpowered. Sammy feels quite weak.
To make it clear, on I looked up some tier lists of commanders, and above S tier they have max tier,
Yeah, yeah, he's
which
just
is
like
just max.
ridiculous.
So Max is broken in half beyond belief. To make it completely clear.
Yeah, well, during the campaign, I found Sammy quite useless, and then came around on using them during the War Room maps. But the way it shakes out really is that during the campaign, you'll often get choices of 3 missions, one for each character, and the mission will be completely different, right? Like the map is different, and their abilities are different. And basically, Max is easy mode, Andy's normal, and Sammy is hard mode generally. And I really liked the structure actually, because it means like you can do different missions if you play through the campaign multiple times. Because like once you pick one of the 3, the other 2 are gone forever until you come back to this point in the campaign. And I liked that I got to like change my difficulty like as I played basically, because I think normally like if you pick hard on a game, you're just locked into a slog for the entire time. I kind of liked, mostly trying to beat the hard missions and then sometimes having a max mission for fun, which was just like full unga bunga. I send my tanks in and they blow everything up. So I thought that was good, and I think and I think this game is targeted probably at players new to the strategy genre. So I think having this kind of option and this kind of variety in the campaign and a bit of variance in the commanding officer's power levels actually does make a bit of sense here. So with that out of the way, let's go into a music break. We'll pick Max's theme, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion about the officer powers. Alrighty, that was Max's theme. Patrick, how did you feel about the CO powers in this game?
In general, the COs are the one thing I would say which really injects a bit of weirdness and unexpected power into what is otherwise a very dry tactical game. One of the things that I think is very interesting about Advance Wars is how restrained it is in its design. We've mentioned several times that it's like battle chess, and the reason for that is that these units don't have special abilities, they don't level up, they always do what you expect them to do. For some people, this is going to be fantastic because there's very little variance in this game. It's a very public information game. But for others, they might find it a bit boring. It's not like your tanks have the ability to teleport, or they pick up a power up on the map and they can suddenly deal double damage for the next 3 turns. These units do what they do and they do it well, but they do it in an expected way. These powers are one of the ways in which the tides of battle can drastically shift, particularly if you give all your units a second turn, which wrecked me on a number of occasions for sure. I agree with you, James. I think that the variance in powers for a single player campaign is a good thing. And if you're going to play competitively, there are some serious problems.
Yeah.
Luckily, if you're going to play competitive Advance Wars today, you can play a. We're going to mention this later, may well mention it now. There's a platform called Advance Wars by Web, AWBW, which is kind of the equivalent of Pokemon Showdown for Advance Wars, where it's like a modified versions of Advance Wars 3 to create a greater sense of balance in the gameplay. And I think that that's going to fix you up for your multiplayer battles mostly.
And I did quite enjoy it because I went from like thinking Sammy was useless to like playing them a bit more and working out how to play, with those weaknesses and strengths, and it ended up being like a fun learning curve. Which I don't think you can really get if you have like try to balance them perfectly.
Well, part of that is that in the single player, a lot of the time you're not even capturing buildings. So capturing buildings is irrelevant or close to irrelevant. So one of her big power points is completely irrelevant.
Yes,
is completely moot. Versus in the larger skirmish maps where capturing buildings is all that matters.
Yes, I agree with that. So I wanted to also talk a bit about game modes, because they've talked about the campaign a bit, but I actually did duck into the war room a lot to buy maps and play those.
Which is a skirmish mode essentially,
yeah,
right? It's
basically.
like 1v1 you start on the same footing.
Yeah, you start on the same footing, and you have a ranking, and you can pick any of your commanding officers, not just the 3 from the campaign, but you can actually get access to all of the enemy commanding officers. Like, you can unlock them. For example, like, if you pick certain missions during the campaign, you may be offered a special mission that beating it lets you unlock that character for use in the war room. You can buy them from this shop that you get coins from beating the campaign and the skirmish style missions. There is a lot of characters to unlock, actually, including the like narrator character and the big bad. And there is actually a hard mode you can buy from the shop upon beating the game, which I'm told is very ball-bustingly hard and is basically like a puzzle game in the tight execution that's required to beat the levels.
Yeah, I haven't played this hard mode, but I did some reading, and yeah, people consider the hard mode of this game like it's not even like a challenge mode. It's like abuse the AI if you want to succeed mode. Like the only way you're getting through this is if you play close to perfectly and maximize the units that you have, because the odds are so heavily stacked against you, which is interesting. I don't think we've ever really played a game that has a new game plus that is this challenging before. And I kind of like that the game has something like this on offer for people who really want to sink their teeth into something difficult.
And I think that it's really good. Like, I was surprised at how actually fully featured Advance Wars 1 feels. There's like so many skirmish maps to buy and unlock, so many commanding officers, a hard mode, multiplayer if you want to bother getting the link cable set up. A full campaign that has different, like, sort of different routes through it and unlockable scenes and that kind of thing. So it really did feel like a complete package, and I'm really quite happy with that. I finished the campaign and actually ended up playing a lot of the optional content afterwards, because I was just having fun and I wanted to mess around with the other commanding officer's abilities. It's like a complete package that offers a pretty good time.
And even though what it means, I mean, it's a pretty short campaign. It'll probably only take you about 5 hours to get through, pending how many times the game kicks your ass as you're figuring stuff out. But for the most part, I think you're going to be you're going to enjoy your time with this game one way or another, whether you stick around for the skirmishes or not. I did have one other major point that I wanted to get into, James,
Yep.
which is the UI and the presentation.
Oh, it's really good, right?
It's excellent. So to start with, before you start the main game, there's a tutorial, and I, being the hot shot that I was like, I don't need to do the tutorial. I've played games like this before, and so what you can do is you can skip to the last mission in the tutorial, which I did because I was like, I don't want to bother with this shit, and then I promptly misunderstood several gameplay elements,
Yeah.
and had to figure it out as I went. And I think that it is an absolute credit to this game that despite me completely skipping the tutorial, I was able to learn all of the restrictions and information in this game simply by fumbling my way through the first several missions. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I think the first is something we discussed earlier, which is that there's a great graphical clarity in this. They've really gone out of their way with their visual design to communicate everything to the player. But they also have made several choices with the gameplay to make it very easy to get the information. And I think that nothing is more true of that than the ability to cancel a unit's action right up to the last moment. So one of the things I did a lot in this game was I would select a unit, I would move it next to an enemy unit, I would hover over that enemy unit to see exactly how much damage I would do to that unit down to, it gives you a percentage out of 100. So you would do, say, 26% damage to that unit. And then it would let you cancel the action. The game lets you scout out exactly what your movement and damage will be to enemy units, and then lets you rewind that action before you commit. And this is such a huge thing, because what it lets you do is it lets you gather information without dying or making mistakes or losing the unit, getting punished essentially. And it lets you do that over and over and over and over without you having to suffer the consequences of it, a la Heroes of Might and Magic 3. Something that I struggled a lot with that game was that it felt that the only way to learn relevant unit strength was to actually get screwed over and then have to reload a save in a lot of cases. What this means is that over the course of even just a short number of missions, you can start internalizing a lot of the relative strengths of these units without having to fail the mission and start it from scratch. And over the course of 2 missions, you will have checked the relevant strengths of these units several times, and it gets to the point where you don't even need to do it. You will know that this unit will probably do about this much damage to this unit and can start acting with confidence far before, after 1 or 2 hours of play. It's really, really good. I cannot praise this system enough, particularly for a game released in 2001. It feels ahead of its time with how cleanly it presents this information to the player.
Yeah, there is a bit of obfuscation with like luck variance when units attack each other, so you can sometimes do a bit more, a bit less damage depending. But I think that kind of like that's a kind of variance that I'm okay with. It's normally like 1 damage or something at the most. Like sometimes your infantry will kill like a 1 HP tank, sometimes they won't. And it kind of like adds a bit of variance that can make matches play out in different ways rather than feeling very, deterministic. So, and I'm kind of okay with that. And you kind of get a feel for how, risky something is as you play.
The variance is low enough that you make enough decisions over a course of the game to mitigate that variance.
Yeah.
It's not like the critical hits in Fire Emblem, which were sometimes nuts.
Yeah.
It's far lower variance, and you can, if you make enough decisions you can account for it and still win in spite of it.
And I think that the fact that units do damage based on their health in this game, like a 2 health means that there's 2 units in the squad, right? Or something like that. All of that kind of ends up helping the game in terms of like strategy. I think some games where they just have like a 1 HP unit does the same, like in Fire Emblem, I think a 1 HP unit does the same as a full HP unit.
Mm.
ends up making strategy a bit worse. Because I made a lot of decisions in this game where, like, I would opt to get 2 units to 2 HP rather than killing one and leaving one tank on full, just because it like made the chance of them killing one of my units a lot lower, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
you were mitigating their strength rather than wiping out an enemy unit. And units can go back to bases to heal, but that
yeah,
takes a long time. And truth be told, at least in the single player, getting a unit to 2 HP is pretty close to killing it because the missions aren't long enough for that conservation of resources to be super relevant.
yeah. But on the whole, like I think the mechanics are really solid and very clear to the player, which is very important.
It's good because it's a tactics game where you can learn as you go without it being super punishing, and that puts it, far above Panzer General, far above Heroes of Might and Magic. I think that the simplicity here makes it far easier to learn than something like Fire Emblem. You can play basically within an hour or two of picking up this game. I feel like you'll have a really good grasp of the basic mechanics, and it does a good job of teaching them to you intrinsically without the game ever descending into being super easy. Like, if you make mistakes, you will get punished for them, but the game gives you all the tools you possibly can to help you avoid those mistakes.
Yeah.
It's very good. I really liked the curve of this campaign and how it taught me how to play it, when I didn't even do the tutorials. So, big fan.
Yeah, agreed. All right, well, let's go to final impressions then, shall we?
There was one final minor point I wanted to talk about, James, and then I'm ready. It's something that my roommate brought up to me, who also is a big fan of Advance Wars. It's the concept of breakpoints. We talked a little bit about the balance of this game, but damage breakpoints is a important concept, particularly for Advance Wars, because of how health is tied to damage. And basically, most units in the game, even if they have an advantage against an enemy unit, won't kill that enemy in one shot.
Yeah.
Or they won't kill them without a power being used, which I think adds a lot of tactical depth to this game because you generally can't just use a medium tank to kill a tank or use a recon unit to kill a mech unit. And, even without defensive bonuses, that's generally true. And this is important because if units could always kill outright enemy units, then the attacking side would have too big an advantage. They already have an
They
advantage,
already
but
do have an advantage.
it would be overwhelming, right? You'd be able to just wipe out the entire enemy force. By always having, or most of the time having enemy units live through the first initial attack, blocking entry points becomes really important because like
Yep.
a tank on a bridge can absorb 2 hits instead of one, and when you attack, well, an enemy tank that's behind you can't get through.
Yeah.
That unit is safe unless they've had the foresight to set up artillery in range of it, which, as we haven't mentioned it before, but artillery can't move and attack on the same turn. And yeah, it's like a small thing with how they've designed and balanced this game, but they've put a lot of effort into the breakpoints, and it also makes the CO powers, which give a bit more power to your units, more meaningful because it can be used to break that breakpoint in the other direction.
Yeah. And it's especially important because I think infantry ends up being the best unit in the game due to their ability to capture, their reasonable movement speed, ability to move over mountains, make use of cover, and just being so cheap that you can gum up the board if you have to in a choke point and just
Hmm.
place artillery behind them. Yeah, I think this all contributes to that feeling good. And I'm glad that, like, the basic unit, even late into the game where you've got medium tanks rolling out, still ends up feeling very valuable to have on the board.
Hmm.
Which I think in some economy based games, that isn't the case, and you end up like obsoleting a lot of your earlier units as the game goes on. So, preserving that tactical identity of the weaker units through, the lack of crazy one shots through cover, I think is a really good thing.
Yeah, and it's what happens when you have units with pronounced weaknesses and pronounced strengths. And the infantry, it's more true of infantry than any other unit in the game.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's go to final impressions then. After a couple more final notes. So I reckon that Advance Wars 1 is an easy recommend. It's a simple but deep turn-based tactics game that is very clear to the player through its UI and its design. It does a really good job of presenting this fun, upbeat atmosphere that the game leans into very heavily. The combat animations look great, and I found the whole game, the economy management, the different mission types, the different commanding officer choices, the amount of content outside of the campaign, and just the depth of the strategic rock paper scissors web between the units made for a very fun time. I struggle to think of any, real shortcomings in this title other than maybe the story, but I don't think it's a major, drag on the game. I think the whole game is a very tight, very accessible package that, anybody who likes strategy games, from newcomers to people who've played a few of them are probably still going to have a good time. So easy recommend from me.
Yeah, and as to me, if you've been listening to the episode, you'll know where I stand on this, which is that Advance Wars is just a fantastic game. I was almost surprised by just how good it is. Its design is very restrained. Like it's not trying to do anything nuts. It's not like the unit list roster is crazy big. Its economy model is simple. It uses a square based grid as opposed to a hexagonal grid to make, unit on unit fights simpler as opposed to something like Panzer General. There's no upgrades or veterancy, but everything that is here is so well constructed. The foundations here are so strong, and that's true from the balance to the basic design to the map design to the length of the campaign. As James said, there's not really anything to deeply criticize here because it gets all of the things that I care about right on the first try. Even something like the story, the fact that they've gone for such a light touch just lets the gameplay shine through stronger, and the aesthetics and general presentation is strong enough that it doesn't feel like the story is getting in the way of the thing I care about. The only, I guess, drawback to this game that I can realistically think of is that you have to love the tactical gameplay because that's really what's on offer here. If you are a person who is more invested in story and characters, you may bounce off Advance Wars a bit because the gameplay here is, to be honest, a bit dry. It's nothing fantastical or special, and the fact that every mission restarts with new units means that you're not really developing any kind of emotional attachment. But I do think that if you're a newcomer to this genre, Advance Wars is still a great entry point if you want to try something like this out because of the clarity of information it delivers and the generally reasonable difficulty curve where you might get your ass kicked in a mission, but the fact that the missions are so short that restarting a mission isn't even that big of a punishment. It just does everything right for anyone who enjoys anything remotely tactical, and I really enjoyed the time I spent with Advance Wars. And I wouldn't mind booting up Advance Wars 2 to see what evolutions it's made with the game. Great game, easy recommend. Good pick, James.
Yeah, I'm glad that it held up as well as I'm glad it was as fun today as it was when I was a kid. It's always a bit rough when you play a game from your childhood and it's not up to snuff anymore. But the simplicity of the design makes it kind of timeless, I think, which is wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was surprised at just how robust everything here is. It's weird because usually with the games we do for this show, they tend to be more imbalanced.
Yeah.
Even the games that I love to pieces, I really enjoyed System Shock 1. That game is messy.
Yeah,
it's a messy game. I think the things it does well are good, but I think it also has a lot of serious problems. Advance Wars feels just like a good game. I can't point to any of it and say they've done this badly. Yeah, maybe when you get into the more multiplayer side of it, there are significant balance problems. But for the purpose of the single player campaign, it just nails
works
it
really well. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels very modern in that regard, I think. Yeah. Okay, so that wraps it up. Thank you so much for listening to our episode of Advance Wars. We are the Retrospectives podcast. My name was Patrick Arthur, and my co-host is James Turlings. You can find all of our content on our website, which is rspodcast.net. It's got links to all of our social media stuff. I've uploaded all of our episodes to YouTube. But you can also listen to them directly or subscribe to us. It's 109 episodes so far, so heaps and heaps of content. Most importantly, we have a link to our Discord server. Our Discord servers is where we do all of our interaction with our community and we accept game recommendations. So if you have any thoughts or comments on this episode or want to recommend us a game to play in the future, we would love to hear it. I would say at least a quarter to a third of our episodes have been listener recommendations. So if you have one, please do drop it by us. The only thing is that we can't really do 100-hour RPGs. The 3-week turnaround does make it hard to play super long games, but anything is a consideration if you have a good enough reason for it. So we would love if you would drop by. And finally, if you would like to support the show monetarily, if you're really enjoying us, we have a Buy Me a Coffee page, which we'll pop a link to in the show notes. And you're more than welcome to if you're interested in giving us a one-off donation, or you can subscribe to us for a monthly cost a la Patreon. So with Advance Wars out of the way, it's time to talk about what we're doing over the next 3 weeks. And it's my choice, and I've gone for a classic that I've actually never played to completion, and that game is Metal Gear Solid 1.
I'm surprised you haven't beaten that game before.
I'm kind of surprised too, to be honest. So the main reason that I never got around to playing Metal Gear Solid 1 is that my first proper console was a PlayStation 2. Like I got a PlayStation 2 around the time the PlayStation 3 release, and the Metal Gear Solid title for the PlayStation 2 was Metal Gear Solid 3. So that was the first one I actually played, and it's the one I fell in love with. I did have a copy of Metal Gear Solid 1 for PC, believe it or not, but it was either only the demo or the copy I had was a pirated version, and it gets to a bit where you get told to check the back of the disc. And the game lost me at that point because, at that point in time, I wasn't smart enough to even think that I needed to check a physical CD in order to progress. So I'm excited too. I do know that Metal Gear Solid 1 is more of an arcadey stealth experience than the later titles, particularly Metal Gear Solid 3. You don't have proning in bushes or anything like that. So I'll be interested to see how it holds up. I mean, I don't think that that's a knock against it. Sometimes a simpler design can lead to something better.
I think the first game still has a lot of strange little interactions and fun bits in it that makes it really enjoyable.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to it, and I know the story is an all-time classic. Although, I think unfortunately by this point, I've been spoiled on the story pretty heavily, if through memes, if nothing else.
Metal Gear Solid 1 is the master of camp. Like, this game knows exactly what it's doing. And it does it well.
Hideo Kojima wanted to make a James Bond film, and that's what we got.
Yeah, I believe one of the translator did a bit of making it more campy than the actual original script, and I think it ended up making the game a lot more enjoyable. So we'll see.
Well, now that we've done Police Noughts and I know what Kojima would do to Lethal Weapon, I have a fair idea what he'd do to James Bond. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. All right. So thanks for listening to our episode on Advance Wars, and we'll see you next time for Metal Gear Solid. See you then.
I'll see you then, guys. See ya.